Last week we spoke of God's warning to the people about getting a king. And Saul was called and anointed and led and had some success. But then there was a time that Saul would do things wrong. He would leave the ways of the Lord. He would focus more on himself than those that he had been called to lead. And it would be time for something new. So that's where we are today, as God talks to Samuel once again and says it is time for a new king. Here in 1 Samuel chapter 15, beginning with verse 34 through 16:13. Then Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his house in Gilboa of Saul. And Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death. But Samuel grieved over Saul. And the Lord was very sorry that God had made Saul king over Israel. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul? I have rejected him from being king over Israel. Fill your horn with oil and set out, and I will send you to Jesse, the Bethlehemite, where I have provided for myself a king among his sons." Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears of it, he will kill me." And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do, and you shall anoint for me the one who I name to you." And Samuel did as the Lord commanded, and he came to Bethlehem, and the elders of the city came to meet him, trembling. And they said, "Do you come peaceably?" He said, "Peaceably, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And he sanctified Jesse and his sons, and he invited them to the sacrifice. When they came, he looked on at Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is now before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." When Jesse called Abinadab, he made him pass before Samuel. And he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Then Jesse called Shammah to pass by. And he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen any of these." And Samuel said to him, "Are all your sons here?" And Jesse said, "There remains the youngest, but he is keeping the sheep." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes." And Jesse sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, and he had beautiful eyes, and was handsome. And the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him, for this is the one." Then Samuel took out his horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord Almighty came upon David that day forward. And Samuel then sent out and went to Ramah. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We're beginning our journey into the life and the story of David. Do you guys really know how much David is in our Bible? It's a lot. Of the characters that are mentioned in the Bible, the first one, could we guess what name shows up the most? Jesus, yeah. And that's just in the New Testament. Does anybody know what number 2 is? It's David. David shows up somewhere 974 times. 900 times in the Old Testament, and then, almost 80 or so in the New Testament. He's an important person in the Bible, really important. So one might think that this person that's mentioned most in the largest testament of the Bible, would come to the scene with some sense of power, because David is there mentioned more than Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or Samuel or any of those names that we pick out from the Bible. The only one that we have more of, like I said, is Jesus. So we would think that, there's going to be something special about how David shows up. But there's not. The king who all other kings would be compared to, the one that we see Christ as the successor. I mean, we have our stories of David, this battle with Goliath, how he becomes this fierce warrior. We would think that there'd be something in that introduction that would make him seem kingly. But there's really not. But before we get there, I want to go back to the first part of that passage, where God asked Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul? Saul was Israel's first king, and it didn't take long for Saul to fall out of favor and for God to move on. We have this mysterious verse in there that I think gets almost passed over. It's that God regretted making Saul king. I mean, when you regret something, it's like you made a mistake. And if God regretted something, it can cause all kinds of theological problems, because that means that God made a mistake, right? And all those things that we have in our mind that we built churches upon and theology upon, that God is all-knowing and all-powerful and perfect, regrets something? And what does that do to our thought of God? What does it mean when God changes God's mind? Which happens a few times in the Bible. This isn't the first time that God had the regrets. God felt the same way just before the flood, where God said, I regret making humanity. I'm just going to clean slate all this crap and just be done. God will say to Jonah, I'm going to wipe Nineveh off the map, and then change the mind the other way and say, you know what? I was being a little too harsh. They've repented. Let's keep this going. So this God that's all wise and all knowing regrets. So what do we make of this? Maybe it's that we're trying to think of God in our terms, where we want to put God into how we think God should be. But this gives us an insight into God's feelings, into God's thoughts. And it's important to have that, because one of the special things I see about our faith is that we have a God that sometimes looks upon us with sorrow when things go wrong. When those that have chosen to lead lose compassion. When there's an ignoring of God's call, of God in general. When the king does what they can to turn themselves into a god. We've learned last week that the kings were going to let the people down. And from the beginning, this happens. So God grieves. God regrets. Which brings us to David. Samuel's sent out to the house of Jesse to find this new king, and Samuel stands before each of the sons, and the first one comes up all tall and strong and handsome, fit to be a king. And Samuel's probably thinking, well, this was pretty easy. Exactly what we needed. But God had different plans. And Samuel goes down the line, and each time God says no, and it seems like Jesse's out of sons. And he says, is there anybody else? Well, yeah, there's the baby, the one that's left, the one out tending to the sheep. The last son, not even fully grown, not strong, not great, the shepherd boy, the least. This is the one that God lifts up. And this is that continuation of the story that we have in the Bible. For those who went through our Genesis Bible study, we saw this time and time again. God lifted up those who did not seem like they should be lifted up. Where we had a world that was always built upon, well, the firstborn is the heir. The firstborn is the one that gets the favor. The firstborn is the one that will continue on the leading. And God has constantly said, no, it's this one. And here, David had been overlooked by his own family. He was an afterthought. When Jesse was told to gather all of his sons, he didn't even think about calling David. Because why would he? He needed to watch the sheep. Why the big people did the business. And we learn that sometimes God takes the smallest and does something great. That was our parable from the gospel of the mustard seed. The smallest of all seeds can grow into this great shrub. It's not the first time that God has favored the underdog. Jacob was chosen over Esau. Joseph was favored over all of his other brothers. The story of Israel is God lifting up the unexpected. And it's a story that we need to remember for two different reasons. First of all too often, this world can bring us down. We each have our own struggles, our trials, our tribulations. And in a world that places importance on material things, it can make that idea of a good heart be unseen. Like we just get lost in the shuffle. Day in and day out, so many good people get up, work, strive for a better life. Maybe show up to church on a Sunday. They might pray or give when they can. And we go through our lives and we live and we die and we hope that we left the world a little bit better. These are not the stories we hear about every day. These are not the stories that we hear about most certainly in our news feeds, and they never really trend. I had the opportunity yesterday to officiate a funeral at the Westminster Church in Auburn for Martha Henderson, who was a Christian educator who lived to the age of 102. And I think of that life that she had when she was able to reach and talk to so many people and kindle a love for God in their hearts. Before I had gotten the message to say, hey, we don't have anybody in the pulpit, can you fill in for us? I had never heard of Martha. But there's a whole crew of people that have been changed by this one person. And a life lived and a love shared. Because God takes notice. God sees you trying. And God sees your struggles and cheers when all goes well. But I think what's more important is that God also weeps when it all falls apart. I need a God that grieves. I need a God that gets hurt. Because that comes when you care. God does not look at you the same way the rest of the world does. Because when God looks at you, God sees love. God sees the greatest creation in the world. Do we still believe that? Have we spent so much time in this world that we can't see it anymore? Do you realize that you're the greatest creation in the world? That the only reason the world is this way is because you are in it. That without you, the world's not the same. And I thank God I live in this world. Through Jesus Christ, each of us share in this kingship of David. Each of us have been filled with God's Spirit. Each of us have been called. Each of us have been known not based on our worldly appearance, but as God's child. And we'll learn from David's story that that doesn't mean everything's perfect. Knowing that we have been sought out and handpicked by God doesn't mean all the struggles disappear. David's story is one of blessings and stumbles. Our lives are filled with the same. The important part of it is that every moment, God is there. The second reason we need to remember this is because God lifts up the least. That deals with us, and it deals with our neighbor. No one, absolutely no one, can be considered unworthy of God's favor and love. God does not choose things based on the power that we see in the world. If anything, it seems like God's drawn to the opposite. The least, the last, the lost, the forgotten, the ones out in the field, the ones that were deemed not important enough to bring in, God is found there. It is the way that David is most certainly brought forth. It's the way that Jesus will be lifted up. The ministry of the Lord is seeing the unseen, accepting the unclean, healing the sick, forgiving the lost. God seeks out the unexpected. And God calls the church to do the same, to stand up for those the world would rather not see, to lift up those that have been forgotten and beaten down, to seek righteousness in the face of injustice. This is the call of the church. My friends, my family, children of God, the world may not see us. The world may not want to see us. But God does. And God calls you. And God is here to lift us up and ask you to reach down and make sure your neighbor comes with you. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.